A foreign hospital, with forms written in bureaucratic jargon I could barely decipher, with nurses who offered me tea but could not offer translation, with hallways that smelled faintly of antiseptic, and something I later realized was incense from a family's vigil in the next ward. I learned to use translation apps to plead for updates, to sign papers I didn't understand, to nod at words like consent and certificate when all I wanted was a miracle. Each night I returned to the apartment we had rented for his contract, walls still echoing with his voice. His toothbrush leaned against mine in the cup by the sink. His shoes waited at the door, ready for a walk he would never take again. I would sit there, staring, and feel the weight of solitude settle in like unwelcome luggage. My family called, of course. Brief calls, tidy calls. "We're praying for you. We have to go now. Your father's back is acting up. Did you buy travel insurance?" My brother Troy even suggested I hire a local service to handle things so I could come home sooner. But how could I leave James there? How could I abandon him in a country where he had no one but co-workers and me? So I stayed. I stayed and navigated a labyrinth of paperwork, of signatures, of stamps pressed into forms by officials who barely looked up. I stayed and chose a grave for him in soil far from Oregon pines, in a cemetery where birds sang a language neither of us knew. The funeral was small, co-workers, a few expatriates, a priest with kind eyes. No family, no lifelong friends. Just me, standing by the open earth, trying to stitch dignity into a moment ripped raw. It was then I began to understand a truth I had avoided all my life. Some people simply do not have the capacity to put others first, even when the world expects them to. My family had been telling me who they were all along, through missed graduations, through hurried departures from celebrations, through excuses that always began with Troy needs. I had chosen not to listen, but standing there, watching them lower my husband into the ground a world away from everyone we loved, I could no longer pretend. The ache of that realization was nearly as sharp as losing James himself. Grief does not arrive alone. It brings its cousins, abandonment and clarity, and they move into the spare room without asking. When the last handful of soil fell, I whispered what I could not say out loud. "I will carry you home, even if only in pieces. I will not let this be the end of our story." And in that vow, somewhere between the incense smoke and the tropical air, I began the long, unsteady march into the next, unwanted chapter of my life. The cemetery in Singapore was nothing like the ones back home. Instead of neat rows of gray stone under pine trees, this one rose out of the city like a pocket of stillness. The air was heavy with humidity, the kind that clung to my skin and made every breath feel weighted. Birds with bright plumage I couldn't name called out from the trees, and incense curled upward from another family's grave, threads of smoke riding prayers into the morning sky. James's headstone was simple, too simple, I thought. Just his name, dates, and a phrase chosen quickly because the paperwork demanded it. Beloved husband. I wanted paragraphs, novels, an entire library carved into stone, but all I had was a line. And then he was gone from sight, lowered into a ground that wasn't ours. The funeral lasted less than an hour. His co-workers stood awkwardly, ties loosened, faces caught between grief and the discomfort of watching a private love unravel in public. A few expatriates we had shared dinners with said kind words, but their sympathy felt borrowed, like clothing a size too big. When the last prayer ended, people drifted back toward the city, back toward lives still moving forward. I stayed behind until the sky dimmed, until the cemetery staff gently told me it was time to leave. Arranging the burial had nearly broken me. In another life, I might have flown him home, brought his body back to Oregon, let his family and mine lay flowers at a familiar grave. But reality is made of invoices and limitations. Transporting a body across the Pacific required sums I could not summon, not with credit cards already bent under the weight of hospital bills. The international insurance covered some, but not enough. The small savings we had built, the ones meant for nurseries and vacations and someday dreams, evaporated into fees, flights, and signatures stamped in blue ink. I carried every form myself. Death certificates that needed multiple authenticated copies, each verified by different offices scattered across the city. I rode buses in the tropical heat, aligned up behind other widows and sons and fathers, words catching in my throat as I tried to explain through apps that mangled my sentences. My grief didn't translate well. Grief never does. I called home every night, desperate for the sound of familiarity. My parents answered sometimes. My mother's voice was brisk, as though she were ticking a box on her to-do list. "We're praying for you, honey. Did you eat? Don't forget to file for reimbursements." My father reminded me to keep receipts. Troy once suggested I just hire someone local to handle it all. As if I could outsource mourning. As if I could trust strangers with the last fragments of James's life. In truth, I was alone. Entirely, completely alone. On the 5th night, I returned to our rented apartment with my arms full of documents, my legs shaking from exhaustion. His shoes were still by the door. His shirt still hung on the chair. His scent lingered faintly on the pillow. I pressed my face into it and sobbed, not the cinematic kind of sobbing, but the raw, animal sound of someone who realizes the world has gone on spinning while hers has shattered. And yet, even in that devastation, a flicker of resolve stirred. I could not leave James there forgotten. I could not let his story end as a footnote in a foreign city, so I promised him I would carry what I could. His books, his journal, the seashells we had collected from weekend trips, his memory. I would carry it all back across the ocean. Even if my family did not meet me, even if no one stood beside me, I would be the vessel that bore him home. That vow was the only thing that steadied me as I booked my return flight. 30 hours of travel loomed ahead, but before I left, I visited the grave one last time. Dawn was breaking and the cemetery was quiet except for the bird song. I knelt on the dewy grass, pressed my palm to the cool marble, and whispered everything I had left to say. I will keep you alive in my heart, every day, for the rest of my life. It was not enough, but it was all I had. On the flight home, the hum of the engines became a kind of lullaby I couldn't surrender to. My body ached for sleep, but my mind was busy excavating old memories, piecing together a mosaic I had ignored for years. Grief has a cruel way of sharpening your vision. It doesn't only show you what you've lost, it shows you what was broken long before. Somewhere over the Pacific, with the cabin lights dimmed and strangers dozing around me, I saw my childhood clearer than I ever had. I was 8 years old again, falling from the rickety treehouse in our backyard. My arm bent at an unnatural angle, pain pulsing like fire. My parents rushed me to the ER, but when the doctor said it would be hours before I was seen, they left me with the neighbor so they could take Troy to his championship soccer game. "He can't miss this," my mother insisted. "The whole team is counting on him." I sat on a plastic chair, arm throbbing, while the neighbor patted my back and said, "They'll be back soon." They weren't. When I earned a scholarship to my dream college, I remember calling home, breathless with joy. My father's first question wasn't congratulations, but calculation. "Will it cost us anything? You know Troy has that summer camp." Troy always had something. A new bat, a better coach, a summer program out of state. And when the bills came due, my parents paid his without hesitation, while I learned to juggle 2 part-time jobs just to afford books. Even the milestones meant to belong to me alone had been shared or overshadowed. At my wedding, my mother criticized my dress as impractical. My father muttered about the cost of the modest venue. Troy arrived late, as usual, and still somehow managed to make himself the center of attention, spinning stories that painted him as the lovable scamp instead of the careless brother who couldn't show up on time. James squeezed my hand and whispered, "We can't change them, but we can choose how much power they have over our joy." I believed him. I chose joy that day, but sitting in the dark cabin now, replaying those moments, I realized how many times I had excused them. How many times I had told myself, this is just how family is. I had mistaken scraps for feasts, crumbs for love, and I had convinced myself that loyalty was the same thing as acceptance. The contrast struck me like turbulence. When James was alive, he saw me. Not as an afterthought, not as the supporting role in someone else's script, but as the main character in our shared story. My family, by comparison, had always treated me like a footnote in Troy's saga. And yet, even after all these years, even after all the evidence, a part of me still expected them to show up when it mattered most. That expectation was what hurt the most. Not their absence. I had grown used to that, but the stubborn hope inside me that this time would be different. That burying my husband in a foreign country, managing impossible paperwork, returning home with his possessions in suitcases, would finally be the thing that made them see me. Finally. But I should have known better. Grief rewrites the ledger of your life. It lists in merciless detail the deposits and withdrawals of love. On that plane, as the hours dragged, I began to tally. My parents' careful devotion to Troy. My mother's ability to remember every detail of his preferences while forgetting mine. My father's quiet pride in his son's achievements contrasted with the transactional questions he reserved for me. It wasn't that they had never loved me. It was that their love was rationed, conditional, offered only when convenient, and in moments when I needed it most, when bones broke, when diplomas were handed, when vows were spoken, that love was nowhere to be found. By the time the plane dipped toward Portland, clouds opening like curtains to reveal the city lights below, I had made an unspoken decision. I could no longer live on the currency of hope. I could no longer wait for my family to become what they had shown me, again and again, they could never be. But knowing something is one thing. Living it, that would come later, in baggage claims and text messages and empty driveways. For now, I sat in that cramped seat, palms pressed together, and whispered a prayer to James. Help me be brave enough to see clearly. Help me be brave enough to stop asking for water from an empty well. It was the first step toward a truth I had avoided all my life. And though it broke me open, there was also a strange relief in it, because once you stop expecting, you also stop waiting. And maybe, just maybe, you begin to heal. Portland greeted me with fluorescent lights and voices echoing over loudspeakers, the kind of welcome that feels more like interrogation than homecoming. 30 hours of travel had turned my body into a husk. I moved on autopilot, each step more muscle memory than choice. My eyes burned, my stomach churned with emptiness, and grief clung to me like a second coat I couldn't take off. At baggage claim, the carousel groaned to life, spitting out luggage with indifference. I spotted mine easily, one black suitcase filled with my clothes and 2 others stuffed with James's belongings. The weight of those bags was more than physical. It was his life, packed into zippers and fabric, things too ordinary to carry the enormity of what they represented. His favorite sweater, still faintly smelling of him, the leather journal I gave him last Christmas, pages filled with notes and sketches, the tie he wore to formal dinners, folded carefully as if he might still need it. Each item was both treasure and torment. I loaded the suitcases onto a cart, my body trembling with fatigue. That's when the wheel caught on a groove in the floor, jerking the cart sideways. The top suitcase tumbled off and burst open, spilling James's clothes across the polished tiles like an accusation. For a moment, I just stared. Shirts, socks, the blue sweater he wore on chilly evenings, all of it lay scattered at my feet, exposed to strangers passing by with their own intact lives. My knees buckled, and I collapsed to the floor, fumbling to gather each piece as tears blurred my vision. The world blurred into fabric and grief. Then a voice, gentle and firm. "Let me help you, ma'am." I looked up to see a woman kneeling beside me, her airport badge catching the harsh light. Gloria, her name tag read. She had kind eyes that crinkled at the corners, eyes that saw me not as a nuisance, but as a person unraveling. Together we collected the clothes, folding them back into the suitcase with more care than I could manage on my own. When everything was packed again, she zipped it closed and rested her hand lightly on the handle. "Are you all right?" she asked. The question shattered me. When was the last time anyone had asked if I was all right? Not if I had insurance, not if I filed the paperwork, not if I planned better. Simply, "Are you all right?" "My husband died," I whispered, the words tasting foreign even though I had repeated them dozens of times. "I just buried him in Singapore." Her face softened with a compassion that asked for nothing in return. She didn't rush to fill the silence, didn't try to fix what couldn't be fixed. She only nodded, eyes steady on mine, as if to say, "I see you." Gloria escorted me through the terminal, past the sliding glass doors that parted like indifference. Outside, the evening air was cool and damp, the kind of chill that seeps into tired bones. She waited with me at the rideshare pickup area, ignoring the constant buzz of airport life around us. "Is someone coming for you?" she asked. I shook my head. "No, my family's busy." Her frown was brief but telling. She didn't press. Instead, when the car arrived, she helped load the luggage into the trunk and squeezed my hand before I climbed in. "Take care of yourself," she said. 3 simple words, but they landed with the force of a benediction. The door shut and the driver pulled away. I glanced back once through the rear window. Gloria was still standing there, watching until the car disappeared into traffic. In the quiet hum of the ride, I realized something stark. The first true kindness I had received on American soil after burying my husband had come from a stranger in an airport uniform. Not from my brother, not from my parents, from Gloria, who owed me nothing, but gave me everything she could in a single moment. Presence, empathy, dignity. And that contrast carved itself deep into me. Because sometimes the family you expect to hold you up lets you fall, and sometimes the stranger you never expected is the one who kneels beside you to help you gather the pieces. The car ride from the airport blurred into gray. Headlights smeared across wet asphalt. The driver's voice a low hum I barely registered. He asked polite questions. Long trip. First time overseas. And I gave vague answers, afraid that if I opened the dam fully, words would pour out that neither of us could carry. I stared out the window at a city that looked both familiar and alien. Portland was still Portland, but I was no longer the woman who had left 6 months earlier. When the driver turned into my neighborhood, I felt my chest tighten. Our house came into view exactly as we had left it, the maple tree out front still bent toward the street lamp. The welcome mat still crooked. It should have felt like homecoming, but instead it felt like trespassing into a life that no longer belonged to me. James would never walk through that door again, never kick off his shoes in the entryway, never complain about the gutter seeds. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with neglect. I had asked my mother to adjust the thermostat before my return, but the house was bone cold. My breath fogged as I stepped into the living room. The mail basket by the door overflowed, unopened envelopes spilling like accusations. In the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed faintly, its contents reduced to expired condiments and a moldy container I didn't dare open. My brother had promised to stock necessities, but the shelves told a different story. Empty, barren, echoing. I was too tired to rage. I simply let my coat slide from my shoulders and collapsed into the armchair by the bedroom window. The bed felt too sacred, too shared. I curled myself into the chair, staring at the shadows of photographs on the walls. Images of us smiling, laughing, dreaming. Now they looked like strangers caught in a play whose ending I already knew. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. I woke to the sound of water, faint at first, then growing louder. A strange gurgling from below. Heart pounding, I staggered downstairs. The kitchen floor shimmered under a thin sheet of water. My socks soaked instantly as I splashed through, searching for the source. A crack in the ceiling above was weeping steadily, water running down the walls, dripping from the light fixture. The temperature had dropped further overnight. The pipes had frozen, then burst. I yanked open the utility closet and found the main shut-off valve. The metal was so cold it burned my skin as I struggled to twist it. Finally, with a groan, the flow stopped. But the damage had already spread, water under the hardwood floors, drywall sagging ominously, insulation heavy with moisture. I stood in the wreckage of my kitchen, shivering, watching droplets form and fall like metronomes. And then came the smell, metallic, sharp, wrong. The carbon monoxide detector wailed suddenly, piercing the silence. Panic surged through me. I stumbled toward the basement, thinking maybe I could fix something, anything. The stairs were slick with water, each step treacherous. At the bottom, ankle-deep in the flooded basement, I reached for the electrical panel with shaking hands. My foot slipped. I braced myself against the box and felt the world explode. A violent jolt shot through my arm, throwing me backward. My head struck the floor with a sickening crack. For a moment, everything went black. When I came to, water seeped into my clothes, my right arm tingled with a numb burn, and something warm trickled down my temple. I touched my face, my fingers came away red. The room tilted as I staggered toward the stairs. Each step was a mountain, my vision narrowing. By the time I reached the main floor, I was barely conscious. I collapsed onto the sofa, body trembling uncontrollably. The detector screamed overhead, warning of invisible poison. My phone lay just inches away on the coffee table, but my hand refused to obey. Darkness edged in, soft and relentless. And in that moment, on a ruined couch in a cold, flooded house filled with poison, I thought of James. I imagined his hand reaching for mine, imagined him saying, "It's okay, Leia, just rest." A strange calm washed over me. Maybe this was the way back to him. Maybe this was the only way the ache could end. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness completely was the pounding at the front door. A voice calling out. Then nothing, only darkness. When I opened my eyes again, the world was white and humming. For a moment, I thought I had crossed over, that the beeping machines were some kind of celestial rhythm. But then I noticed the Roman 4 line taped to my hand, the scratch of hospital sheets against my skin, and the steady presence of a nurse adjusting monitors beside me. "You're safe," she said softly. "You're at Portland General." Later, I would learn the full story. Diane Foster, my neighbor from across the street, had noticed water flowing out from under my front door. At first, she thought it was just runoff from the storm, but when she heard the carbon monoxide alarm screaming inside, she didn't walk away. She called 911, and then she stayed, pounding on my door until firefighters arrived. They broke it down and found me unconscious on the couch, my body sliding toward hypothermia, carbon monoxide filling the air, a fresh cut bleeding across my temple. The paramedics told me afterward that I was minutes away from not waking up at all. That jolt of electricity in the basement, the freezing water, the poison in the air, it was a perfect storm of disasters. "Another hour," one of them said, shaking his head, "and we'd be talking about a very different outcome." But fate or chance or maybe James watching over me had intervened. The hospital became a strange halfway house between life and death. The doctors warmed my body, stitched my wound, treated the carbon monoxide poisoning with oxygen, and monitored the arrhythmias in my heart caused by the shock. Nurses came and went with quiet efficiency, adjusting Roman 4, taking vitals. One of them, a woman named Sarah, asked about my circumstances after noticing the wedding ring on my finger and the Singapore stamps in my passport. In my fog of exhaustion, I told her everything. James's sudden death, the foreign funeral, the family who couldn't be bothered to pick me up from the airport. I didn't realize my words would travel further than her chart. Because in another wing of the hospital, a local reporter named Michael Chen was covering storm-related injuries for the evening news. He overheard a paramedic retelling my case in the break room. Widow comes back from burying her husband overseas, asks her family for a ride, and they tell her to get an Uber. Then her house floods, the pipes burst, and she nearly dies from carbon monoxide. You can't make this stuff up. Michael didn't. He wrote it down. That night, Diane spoke to his camera, her voice breaking as she said, "She looked so tired when I saw her get home. I meant to check in, but I was busy preparing my own house for the storm." I feel terrible knowing she was going through all of that alone. The paramedics confirmed what they had found. Me unconscious, my phone still open to the family group chat where my brother had typed, "We're busy. Try Uber." The contrast was too sharp, too brutal. A woman drowning in grief and disaster, reaching out for help, and her own family brushing her aside like a nuisance. By the 10 p.m. broadcast, my story was everywhere. The Chiron read, "Local woman returns from husband's overseas funeral, nearly dies after family refuses airport pickup." My private shame had become public record. Screenshots of the group chat began circulating online, leaked by someone at the hospital. People didn't just watch, they reacted. The hashtag #NoWorries, the same words I had typed back in that cramped airplane seat, started trending locally. Strangers shared their own stories of abandonment. The friend who disappeared after a cancer diagnosis, the sibling who never showed up during a divorce, the parent who said, "You'll be fine," instead of "I'm here." My pain had become a mirror for thousands. And then something extraordinary happened. Local businesses began to respond. A plumbing company offered to fix my burst pipes free of charge. A restoration service promised to handle the water damage. A hotel chain donated a 2-week stay while repairs were made. A grief support group reached out with counseling services. Neighbors I had barely spoken to knocked on the hospital door, offering casseroles, flowers, or just their presence. For the first time since James collapsed in that faraway office, I felt something crack open inside me, not grief, but astonishment. Astonishment that strangers could show up in ways my own family never had. Meanwhile, my family was watching too, and when they saw our private conversation plastered across evening news and social media, their carefully polished image began to unravel. That night, just after the segment aired, they came rushing into my hospital room. My brother Troy first, his face pale. "They're making it sound like we abandoned you," he stammered. My mother followed, already on the defensive. "This is a complete misrepresentation. We had no idea your house was in such condition." But their voices rang hollow, because the world had already seen the truth, and so had I. The hospital room was crowded, not with people, but with performances. My family stood around me, each one assuming a role they thought the world expected of them. Troy hovered near the foot of the bed, scrolling on his phone, his face tight with irritation. I knew that look. He was checking social media, calculating how much damage the story had done to his reputation. My mother perched on the chair by my side, fussing with the items on my tray, rearranging them as though neatness could disguise neglect. My father stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable, as if staring out at the parking lot excused him from engaging. They hadn't come because of me. They had come because of optics, because people were talking. Dr. Reynolds entered with a clipboard, reviewing my chart with the calm professionalism of someone who has seen too much to be shaken. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, "your injuries are significant but manageable. With rest and care, you'll recover, but the concussion requires monitoring. You should not be left alone for the next 48 hours. Before I could answer, my mother's voice softened into a saccharine tone I barely recognized. "Of course, doctor. She'll come home with us. Our family sticks together during difficult times." She even patted my arm as she said it, a gesture rehearsed for an audience. Dr. Reynolds glanced at me, not her. "And are you comfortable with that plan?" His eyes were steady, searching. I hesitated. The silence stretched, filled with the hum of machines and the weight of unspoken history. Troy jumped in too quickly. "She has us. We're her family. There was just a misunderstanding about her arrival time. The media blew it out of proportion." But the words rang false, and even the doctor seemed to sense it. He pressed on. "If she is to recover properly, she needs peace, consistency, and genuine support. Nothing else will do." His gaze stayed on me, as if to remind me the decision was mine. A nurse named Jessica entered with medication and a breakfast tray. She had been there since early morning, quiet but observant, witnessing the way my family's tone shifted whenever hospital staff were present. As she checked my vitals, she leaned close enough that only I could hear. "Are you comfortable with this plan? Because there are alternatives." The words landed like a lifeline. Alternatives. The idea that I didn't have to surrender myself back into the same cycle of neglect disguised as duty. That I could, for once, choose differently. My mother stiffened, catching just enough of Jessica's tone to bristle. "She's coming home with us where she belongs." Jessica ignored her, eyes steady on mine. "The choice is yours." Something broke loose inside me then, not anger, not even defiance, but clarity. The kind of clarity grief carves into you when it strips everything else away. I heard James's voice in memory, gentle but firm. "We can't change them, but we can choose how much power they have over our joy." I took a breath, my voice shaking but audible. "I'd like to hear about the alternatives." The room went silent. Troy froze mid-text. My mother's mouth opened, then closed without sound. My father turned from the window with a frown, as if the cityscape had betrayed him. "Amelia," my mother finally managed, her tone incredulous. "You can't be serious, after everything we've done." The words slipped out before I could stop them. "What exactly have you done?" And once spoken, they couldn't be taken back, nor did I want to. I listed it calmly, fact by fact, not accusation but truth. When James was dying, you were too busy to come. When I buried him alone, you said flights were too expensive. When I needed a ride from the airport after 30 hours of travel, you told me to get an Uber. When the house flooded, you had bridge club and business dinners. So please tell me what you have done that entitles you to control my recovery now. Troy's face flushed. "That's completely unfair. We didn't know." "You didn't ask," I interrupted. My voice was steadier now. "Not once did you ask how I was really doing. Not once did you offer help without conditions. You didn't need the news to know I was grieving. You chose not to see it." My mother's hands trembled as she smoothed her skirt. "Families can't drop everything for every crisis. Your expectations are unrealistic. Needing a ride from the airport after burying my husband is unrealistic," I asked quietly. "Hoping someone might check that the heat was working so I wouldn't freeze to death. That's asking too much." Silence again. A silence that wasn't empty this time, but full of truth, of reckoning, of the undeniable weight of years. For the first time in my life, I wasn't pleading for recognition. I wasn't bargaining for scraps. I was naming what had always been there, and it felt less like confrontation and more like liberation. I didn't hate them, but I would no longer pretend they were the well I could draw water from. Not anymore. The social worker arrived the next morning with a folder tucked under her arm. Miss Pytel, a woman with calm eyes and a voice that held the weight of both firmness and kindness, pulled a chair beside my bed. She glanced at my family, who stiffened instantly, then turned her full attention to me. "Amelia," she said, "we've been contacted by several community organizations who would like to help. You have options." Options. The word itself felt radical. My family had always acted as though theirs were the only hands I could reach for, even when those hands weren't extended. To hear that I had choices, that people outside of bloodlines could step in with real support, felt like sunlight cracking through clouds. Miss Patel laid out the details. A local hotel chain had offered a 2-week stay while my house was being repaired. A plumbing and restoration company had already begun work, free of charge, determined to undo the damage left by frozen pipes. A grief support group met twice a week at a community center, ready to welcome me into their circle. A meal delivery service had donated prepared food for the first month of my recovery. Neighbors I barely knew had volunteered to check in regularly, to help with errands, to simply sit with me when silence grew too heavy. I listened, stunned. The generosity was overwhelming, but what struck me most was its sincerity. None of these people owed me anything. They weren't helping to protect an image or to avoid gossip. They were helping because that's what human beings do when they see someone drowning, they reach. My mother fidgeted beside me, clearly unsettled. "That's very kind," she interjected, "but unnecessary. She'll be coming home with us." Her smile was tight, the kind worn for photographs. Family takes care of family. Jessica, the nurse, met my eyes and repeated softly, "The choice is yours." And in that moment I knew. I turned to Miss Patel. My voice was quiet but certain. "I'll accept the community's help." The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's face reddened with indignation. Troy sputtered, "You're choosing strangers over your own blood." "I'm choosing kindness over obligation," I replied. "I'm choosing to heal without conditions attached." My father, ever the quiet one, finally spoke, his voice low. "Amelia, grief can make people irrational. Think carefully. This isn't." "This is clarity," I interrupted. "For the first time in years, I see things clearly." Their arguments blurred after that. My mother gathering her purse with a dramatic flourish, Troy muttering about damage control, my father sighing as though disappointment were oxygen. They filed out one by one, leaving behind a silence that felt nothing like abandonment and everything like relief. Jessica adjusted my pillows and whispered, "That took courage." I shook my head. "It feels like giving up." "No," she said gently. "It feels like you're finally giving yourself permission to stop carrying their weight. That isn't giving up, it's choosing to live." That afternoon, representatives from the different organizations visited. The hotel manager handed me a welcome packet, his voice warm and matter-of-fact. "We've stocked the suite with groceries, but let us know if you need anything more." The restoration team showed me photos of their progress, drywall already torn out, floors drying under industrial fans. The grief support group coordinator introduced herself, offering nothing more than, "We meet Tuesdays and Thursdays. You don't have to talk until you're ready." Every interaction was small, ordinary, and yet each one chipped away at the loneliness I had carried like armor. For the first time since James collapsed in that office, I felt surrounded. Not by family who looked away, but by strangers who looked directly at me. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the hospital blinds, I thought of James. Of how he used to say, "Your worth isn't measured by who fails to see it." I whispered into the quiet, I think I finally understand. And though grief still pressed heavy on my chest, a new seed had been planted beneath it. A seed of belonging, not the kind inherited by blood, but the kind forged by choice, by kindness, by community. It wasn't happiness. Not yet, but it was hope. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of slow, deliberate recovery. At the Riverview Hotel, where the community had placed me, the suite overlooked the river that carved through Portland. Each morning, light rippled off the water, and for the first time since Singapore, I felt something more than survival. I felt steadiness. The bed was warm, the meals arrived on schedule, and the faces that checked in on me, neighbors, volunteers, strangers turned friends, carried no trace of obligation. Their presence was simple, unadorned, and therefore deeply true. Physically, my body healed faster than I expected. The concussion eased, though headaches lingered. The electrical burn faded to a faint scar across my hand. The stitches on my temple dissolved into a thin silver line, nearly hidden in my hairline. But it was the emotional wounds that demanded more time. Each visit to the grief support group reminded me that loss is not a solitary language. Others had buried spouses, parents, children. Others carried photos in their wallets or rings on chains around their necks. We sat in a circle, speaking in fragments, sometimes in silence. And slowly, the jagged edges of my grief dulled, not because it diminished, but because it was shared. 3 months after James's death, the life insurance funds were finally processed. I had dreaded this moment. Money in exchange for a heartbeat, numbers that could never equal laughter or touch. Yet, as I sat at the desk in my hotel room, I felt James's presence in the decision I made. Together, we had always dreamed of education, of giving opportunities to those who came after us. So I established the James Henderson Memorial Scholarship for International Education at our alma mater. But this was not just any scholarship. It carried safeguards born of my own devastation. Emergency travel funds, contingency support, provisions to ensure that if another student ever faced crisis abroad, their families would not be stranded, helpless, as I had been. Working on the scholarship details gave shape to my grief. Pain became blueprint, memory became architecture. Each clause I added felt like a bridge between James's love for learning and the legacy I wanted to leave in his name. On what would have been our 11th anniversary, I invited a small circle of friends and supporters to my restored home. The restoration team had not only repaired the damage but improved it. Smart thermostats, stronger plumbing, protections against future storms. My house no longer looked like the place where I had collapsed. It looked like the place where something new could grow. That evening, surrounded by people who had chosen to stand with me, I presented the scholarship's first award to a bright-eyed junior named Angela, planning to study in Japan. As I placed the certificate in her hands, I felt James close, not as a ghost, but as a quiet thread in the fabric of the moment. The room filled with applause, and for the first time, joy and grief coexisted without tearing me apart. My family had been invited. They declined, citing prior commitments. Their absence did not surprise me. What did surprise me came a week later. A letter, handwritten from my father. His words were halting, imperfect, but honest in a way I had never seen before. "I have been thinking about what happened after you returned from Singapore," he wrote. "While your mother and brother may never see it clearly, I want you to know that I recognize our failure, not just in airport rides or house repairs, but in the deeper duty to be present during your darkest hours. I have no excuses to offer, only acknowledgement, late and insufficient. The man you married would be proud of the woman you have become in his absence. Perhaps, if you are willing, we might find a way forward, not as we were, but as we could be. I read the letter 3 times before I set it down. For days, I carried it in my bag, touching it like a wound and a bomb all at once. When I showed it to my therapist, she asked me the hardest question of all. What do you want from a relationship with your father? Not what you think you should want or what might make him feel better, but what would serve your own healing. The answer did not come quickly, but when it did, it was simple. Boundaries, lunches, just the two of us, conversations that acknowledged the past without rewriting it. No holidays, no forced gatherings, no pretending at unity. If a relationship was to exist, it would be built on truth, not performance. When I wrote back setting these terms, I expected resistance. Instead, my father agreed. Our first lunch was awkward, the silence thick. The second was lighter. By the third, there was something careful but genuine between us. It wasn't a perfect repair, it was something new, and that was enough. And maybe that was the point. Grief doesn't rebuild what was, it builds what can be. A year after James's death, I stood once again in an airport. The irony wasn't lost on me, that so much of my story had been written in these sterile terminals, under fluorescent lights, with the smell of coffee and disinfectant lingering in the air. But this time, I wasn't returning from tragedy. I was boarding a plane bound for Singapore, carrying flowers, letters, and the strength I had gathered piece by piece over 12 long months. I was going back to visit James's grave on the anniversary of his passing. Around me, families reunited with embraces that lifted feet off the floor, children squealing, spouses kissing like the world had stopped just for them. I watched it all without bitterness, though sadness hummed quietly in my chest. Once, I had longed for my own family to meet me at gates, to hold me in moments of unraveling. Now I understood. Some families cannot give what they never had. And that truth no longer hollowed me out. It simply was. Because in the absence of their presence, I had discovered something unexpected. The family we create. Diane, the neighbor who saved me. Gloria, the airport worker who had knelt beside me. Jessica, the nurse who reminded me my choices mattered. Angela, the scholarship student who carried James's dream forward. Countless strangers who had shown up not with excuses but with casseroles, tools, hotel vouchers, and most of all, compassion. They had become my circle, my chosen kin, proof that love need not share a surname to be real. As the boarding call echoed, I thought of my father's letter, the tentative bridge it had built. Our lunches continued, cautious but honest. My mother and Troy remained distant, still orbiting in their own worlds, unwilling or unable to face what had been broken. And for the first time in my life, that distance did not feel like a rejection. It felt like space I had finally learned to keep for myself. Singapore was warm and heavy with scent when I arrived. At the cemetery, the birds still sang their strange, sweet songs. The air still shimmered with humidity. I laid the flowers gently, pressed my palm to the stone, and whispered, "We made it through, James. Not how we wanted, but we did." The ache was still there. I suspect it always will be. But woven into that ache was something new. Resilience, community, the fragile beginnings of peace. And now, dear listener, if you have ever found yourself abandoned when you needed support most, let me say this: your worth is not measured by those who failed to show up. Sometimes the family you expect cannot provide the water you thirst for, but that doesn't mean you go thirsty forever. Strangers can become kin. Neighbors can become lifelines. Compassion can come from the most unexpected places. So I ask you, what unexpected sources of kindness have you discovered in your darkest times? Who showed up when you thought no one would? Share your story in the comments below. Because your voice matters, your boundaries are valid, and healing, even after the harshest winter, is always possible. And if this story resonated with you, I invite you to subscribe. Not just to follow along, but to remind yourself, you are not alone in this. Here, we honor the stories of loss, of resilience, of love that survives in unexpected forms. James used to tell me, "I've always been proud of you. It's yourself you need to make proud." I think, finally, I have. As I close this story, I want to pause and thank you for listening, for staying with me through every turn of heartbreak and healing. Stories like mine are not easy to tell, and I imagine not always easy to hear. But perhaps that is why they matter. Because somewhere in these words, maybe you saw a reflection of your own journey, your own longing, your own quiet strength. Grief, family, resilience, these are not just my themes. They belong to all of us. They remind us that life can fracture in an instant, but it can also mend in unexpected ways. That kindness from a stranger can weigh more than a lifetime of empty promises, and that every single one of us deserves to be seen, to be valued, to be loved. So, to each of you who shared this time with me, thank you. Your presence here is no small gift. May you carry forward not only the lessons of this story, but also the conviction that your boundaries are valid, your healing is possible, and your worth has never depended on someone else's ability to recognize it. I wish you and your loved ones health, peace, and joy. May your families, whether chosen or by blood, be places of warmth, support, and laughter. And if you found comfort in these words, I invite you to stay with us, to subscribe, and to continue walking together through the stories that remind us what it means to be human. Until next time, take care of yourself and take care of one another. Thank you, and may you and your family be blessed with happiness and health. Welcome, friend. If family stories matter to you, you're in the right place. Here we explore the fragile bridges between love and duty, the storms that test them and the quiet miracles that rebuild them. If you've ever felt unseen in a room full of your own relatives, consider subscribing, not because numbers matter, but because your story does. And this is a place where stories like yours are treated with care. Title: I texted the family group chat. Flight lands at 5 p.m. Can someone pick me up? My brother replied. My name is Amelia, and I am writing to you from that thin margin where grief is both a room and a mirror, where every step forward rattles the furniture of memory. Today, I have returned home from burying my husband overseas. The sentence sounds simple until you live inside it. Then it groans with weight. 30 sleepless hours stretched me thinner than a whisper. I watched a dozen time zones pass like dim hallway lights, Singapore to Tokyo to Seattle, and finally Portland, where the winter sky pressed itself flat against the glass. There are flights where the cabin is half prayer and half apology. This was one of them. The woman beside me slept with a sweater bunched beneath her cheek. The man across the aisle watched old sitcom reruns, laughter bleeding from tinny earbuds. Somewhere over the Pacific, I tried to cry and found the well was dry. Grief had taken a number and stood quietly in line, waiting for me to sit still. When wheels touched American ground, my phone woke up angry, cell towers rushing toward me like old friends who'd forgotten why we fell out. I opened the family group chat as the plane taxied. There are messages that feel like knocking on a door you already know is locked. But I knocked anyway. Flight lands at 5:00 p.m. Can someone pick me up? Simple words, no adjectives. Sometimes we hide our bruises inside plain sentences. The 3 pulsing dots showed up, disappeared, returned. My brother Troy wrote first with the casual efficiency of a calendar reminder. We're busy. Try Uber. I could almost hear him clearing his throat, the way he does when a meeting runs long but he wants you to believe it's under control. A moment later, my mother added the acid that always cleans the mess of obligation. Why didn't you plan better? I reread both messages as the seatbelt sign dinged off, and 60 passengers unclipped themselves from obedience. My thumbs typed, "No worries" by muscle memory. My heart wrote something else. A small collapse, like a shelf you've been meaning to reinforce, finally letting go under the weight of old cookbooks and an inherited vase. It doesn't shatter dramatically. It just sighs and gives in. I could tell you that this surprised me. That would make me a kinder narrator than I deserve to be. The truth is, my family has always been a careful choreography of attention and absence. When I was valedictorian, my parents sat through my speech, then hustled out for Troy's baseball game, as if pride has a curfew and mine had overstayed. At my wedding, Mom spent an hour negotiating with the florist and another hour negotiating with her own disappointment. Dad checked his watch whenever the music got too happy. Troy arrived late with the wrong girlfriend and a story about traffic that made him the hero of his own delay. People like to say that grief is a season. I have learned it is also a spotlight. It shows you the edges of people you love, the hard borders you used to mistake for softness. It reveals what holds and what only looked sturdy from a distance. The aisle shuffled forward. I stood when the row in front of me stood and rolled my bag toward customs like a pilgrim dragging a pew. A boy in a knit hat bounced his heels and asked his mother how long it takes to get to America. She laughed and told him, "We're already here." I wanted to kneel down and tell him that sometimes arriving and belonging are two different flights that never quite meet at the gate. The baggage claim turned its quiet carousel. I watched my life in 3 pieces rotate toward me, 1 suitcase with my clothes, and 2 more with James's. His favorite sweater rolled against his running shoes, the leather journal I gave him last Christmas, the watch I saved 2 months to buy for our 5th anniversary. Things have a way of growing heavier when the person who gave them meaning is no longer there to carry even a corner. On the walk to the exit, my phone buzzed again. Troy, seriously, sis, we can't rearrange our schedule last minute. This is why planning exists. Mom, your father and I have dinner with the Hendersons. We RSVP'd weeks ago. Then Dad, a line that felt like weather masquerading as love. Forecast says rain later. Drive carefully. There is a kind of silence that happens in a crowded place, the kind you only hear inside your own body. The terminal hummed with announcements and rolling wheels and reunion squeals, but inside me, the volume turned down to snow. No worries, I typed again, which is the family password for the room where we store all the things that are absolutely worries. There are moments in a life, some people call them hinge moments, where the door you've been walking through your whole life swings one way instead of the other. Standing under those fluorescent airport lights, I made a promise to the person who needed me most, myself. I promised not to ask an empty well for water again, not because I hated the well, but because thirst is not a moral failing. It's a human one, and I had been too thirsty for too long. I want to tell you about James. If I only say he was kind, you will nod and keep going. Kindness sounds like wallpaper. What it felt like was this. Sophomore year, he spilled coffee on my ancient economics textbook and insisted on replacing it with a brand new edition I didn't need. "It's not the book," he said. "It's the sorry." He had big, serious eyes and a laugh that bent like sunlight through blinds. We built a small life that never felt small. Thursday night game nights, a garden where my tomatoes grew like they had something to prove, a home office that was going to be a nursery when the time comes. He used to joke that my tomatoes could win ribbons at the state fair if I stopped eating them on the porch first. Before the aneurysm, before the foreign hospital, before the 5 days of holding a warm hand that couldn't hold back, he told me, 6 months will fly, Leah. Then we start the next chapter. If you've ever loved someone who believes in later, you know what a holy thing that is. Later is a promise disguised as a calendar. And now, what now? I dragged his sweater back across an ocean and learned the cost of a body's return is too much for a savings account built with careful grocery lists and a decade of modest vacations. Now, I traded sleep for forms and tears for stoicism, because immigration kiosks understand only the language you can print in boxes. Now, I came home to a family group chat that uses RSVP as confession and a daughter's grief as bad timing. If you are listening and something in you recognizes this tune, I want you to hear me. Your boundaries are not unkind. They are a way of telling your own heart, I will not leave you waiting on a curb with a suitcase and the rain coming in. Outside the terminal doors, evening lay over Portland like a wool coat. I pulled up the rideshare app because dignity, I've learned, sometimes costs $78 in surge pricing. A woman with a name tag, Gloria, caught the top suitcase as its wheel jammed and it thumped to the floor, spilling socks and a blue sweater that still remembered the shape of his shoulders. "You all right, ma'am?" she asked, and the question was so indecently tender that something in me broke. Not the tragic break of television, but the kind that lets the light and air in. "I buried my husband," I said. "Today." "I'm sorry," she answered, full stop, no advice trailing behind like a leash. She helped zip the suitcase, nudged the cart forward, and waited with me under the awning until the driver pulled up. She did not ask about dinner plans or calendars. She did not recite the weather. She stood there, a stranger standing all the way there, one more honest presence than I had felt from people who share my last name. Before I climbed in, she squeezed my hand the way you test bread for warmth. "Take care of yourself," she said. It landed with the authority of a prescription. The door shut. The car moved. Portland blurred by in gray brush strokes. Somewhere a carbon monoxide detector learned a new song. Somewhere a neighbor across the street watched water begin to thread beneath a sealed door. Somewhere a reporter sharpened a pencil. But for the next few minutes, I only had one job: stay in my body. Breathe. Be the person who kept a promise to herself in the bright, unflattering light of an airport. It wasn't much. It was everything. When people ask me what grief feels like, I want to tell them it is less like a storm and more like a long layover. You sit in an anonymous terminal, lights buzzing overhead, and all the clocks tell you it should be time to go. But your name is never called. Everyone else boards, everyone else departs. You stay seated with your ticket in hand, waiting for a gate that will never open. Before my life was reduced to a handful of suitcases and the hollow echo of airport announcements, it was, by most standards, good. Picture perfect, some might even say. James and I had a rhythm that hummed like a well-loved record. We met in college, the sort of story that sounds too ordinary until you're the one living inside it. He spilled coffee on my economics textbook in sophomore year. Most people would have muttered, "Sorry," and hurried on. James insisted on buying me a new book, then insisted on dinner to make up for ruining the old one. That's how it began, two stubborn insistences that turned into a lifetime of choosing each other. We married right after graduation. He slipped into software engineering as though the profession had been waiting for him. I climbed my way through the crowded hallways of marketing until I wore the title of director on my office door. In Portland, we found a 2-story house tucked into a neighborhood where children rode bikes in circles and neighbors waved whether you knew their names or not. Every spring, I planted tomatoes that grew like wild ambition. James liked to tease, "You could win state fair ribbons with those," though we both knew I never would. They were ours, not for judges or ribbons, but for evenings spent slicing them over fresh bread, laughing about nothing in particular. 10 years sped by with the swiftness of a film reel. We filled Thursdays with game nights, our living room cluttered with dice, cards, and friends' half-empty glasses. We saved for a future we believed in, one vacation at a time, one line in the bank ledger at a time. We dreamed in plural. A spare bedroom doubled as a home office, but we both knew it would someday hold a crib, walls painted in soft colors, shelves lined with bedtime stories waiting for small hands. If I'm honest, it was the kind of life that tricks you into believing permanence is your birthright. You imagine that tomorrow is guaranteed, that later is a currency you can spend freely. We thought we had endless tomorrows, until last fall when an email changed everything. James had been offered a 6-month contract in Singapore with an international tech firm. It was the kind of opportunity that lifts a career onto a different track. Global experience, new markets, the sort of bullet point recruiters circle with a red pen. He hesitated only long enough to ask if I was ready for the adventure. I said yes before he finished the question. We carved a plan. I would work remotely for 3 months, then fly back and forth, splitting our time between continents. We looked at it not as separation, but as expansion, a way of writing another chapter together. The night before his flight, we cooked at home. I can still see it as clearly as if it were painted on glass. The soft jazz humming through the speakers, the candles flickering on the dining table, his hand reaching across for mine. 6 months will fly by, he promised, thumb brushing the edge of my knuckles. And then we start the next chapter. People talk about promises lightly, but when they come from someone who always kept them, they take on the weight of scripture. James was a man who returned every call, who remembered every birthday, who never let you stand in a crowded room feeling small. He believed in the sanctity of later, and so did I. Singapore was vibrant, dazzling in its contrasts. When I visited over the holidays, it felt like we were on a second honeymoon. Mornings spilled into hawker centers where steam rose from bowls of laksa. Evenings were spent wandering Marina Bay, skyscrapers reflecting starlight, weekends on ferries to nearby islands where the world slowed down. He introduced me to colleagues who quickly became friends. We spoke about the baby we might try for when the contract ended. Looking back now, those weeks shimmer like glass, bright, fragile, breakable. They were the last stretch of life before the phone call that cracked everything open. But in those days, I believed in abundance, in love that stretched across oceans, in a family we hadn't yet made but were ready to. That's what grief steals most cruelly, not the past, but the future you thought you'd earned. There is a photograph I still keep tucked inside a drawer, James standing at the airport the morning of his flight to Singapore. He's smiling, one hand raised in a half wave, the other clutching his carry-on strap. Behind him, the departure board glows with destinations, cities that sound like invitations. Tokyo, Seoul, Sydney. His face looks excited, steady, as if stepping into the unknown was just another kind of adventure. Mine, behind the camera, looked brave only because I believed his promise. 6 months will fly by. He said it like a fact, not hope. 6 months and then the next chapter. That phrase, the next chapter, became a refrain between us, something we folded into conversation the way some couples use pet names. If he texted, "Long day," I replied, "Next chapter's closer." If I sent gardens already sprouting, he answered, "Save me some tomatoes for our next chapter." The words made distance less like absence and more like an investment. At first, it worked. We video called every day, sometimes more than once. Morning for me meant late night for him, and we often laughed at the absurdity of brushing our teeth together in 2 hemispheres. He'd angle the camera so I could see the skyline outside his apartment, a city pulsing with neon and possibility. I'd show him my office, cluttered with campaign drafts, or tilt the phone toward the garden, frost still clinging to the edges of last season's soil. Technology turned the Pacific Ocean into a screen small enough to fit in my hand. 2 months in, I packed a suitcase and flew to Singapore. I told myself it was just a visit, but the truth is I needed proof that our lives still overlapped. I needed to touch the place where his voice lived, to hear it echo in real rooms. He met me at Changi Airport with flowers awkwardly sticking out of his backpack. His grin stretched so wide it looked borrowed from a younger version of himself. Those 3 weeks felt like a reprieve. We explored side streets where vendors sold fruit I couldn't pronounce, rode trains that whispered through tunnels smoother than any I'd known at home, and sat shoulder to shoulder on ferries bound for islands dotted with palm trees and soft sand. At night, lying under the whir of a ceiling fan, we spoke out loud what we had only typed before. That maybe the nursery shouldn't wait. That maybe 6 months would end with more than a contract and a line on a resume. The spare bedroom back in Portland, still painted pale yellow, seemed to glow brighter in our imagination. I didn't know then that this would be the last time James and I spoke about the future as if it were ours to command. If I had, I would have memorized the timbre of his voice when he said baby, traced the shape of his smile until it imprinted on my eyelids. I would have bottled the air of that humid room, fans spinning, city buzzing below, and kept it beside me for the day when air would taste like absence. We don't know when we are living in the hinge of a story. We don't know which goodbyes are rehearsal and which are curtain calls. We pack our bags and board flights. We kiss at gates. We say see you soon like it's a promise carved into stone. And then one day, without warning, life calls the bluff. I flew home to Portland at the end of that visit with my heart stitched together by his assurances. I opened the door to our house, dropped my suitcase in the hallway, and thought, 3 more months. That's all. Then the next chapter begins. I didn't know that by the time those 3 months passed, the word chapter would sound like a cruel joke, that the promise of later would collapse under the weight of a single phone call, the kind that cuts a life into before and after. But for a little while, I lived in the glow of his promise, carried forward by the faith that love plus time equaled forever. For a little while, I believed 6 months would fly by. It was an ordinary morning in Portland, the kind you barely notice until you realize it has branded itself into your memory. The kind where the kettle whistles too loudly, the neighbor's dog barks at nothing, and sunlight filters through blinds like Morse code you don't bother to translate. James and I were on our usual video call. His face filled the screen, tired but still wearing that half-smile he saved just for me. He rubbed at his temples and said, "Headache again, probably just stress. Big deadline this week." I teased him gently, "You and your deadlines, you treat them like gods," but behind my words was a prickle of unease. He had never been one to complain about his body. James was the sort of man who jogged in the rain, who carried groceries 2 bags at a time just to make me laugh. For him to admit pain, that was new. 8 hours later, my phone rang again, only it wasn't James. It was his coworker, a man whose name I barely knew, whose voice shook as he told me what had happened. James had collapsed in a meeting. An ambulance had come. He was at the hospital. They're saying it's serious. Some phone calls do not belong to the world of the living. They belong to some other universe, one where air is too thick and words splinter before they reach you. I don't remember how I packed. I only remember the sound of my own breathing, ragged, as if my lungs were learning the alphabet again. I booked the first available flight, 26 hours of airports and layovers, and praying into seatbelt buckles. By the time I reached Singapore, James was already in a coma. The doctor, with English practiced but halting, said the words like stones dropped into water. Brain aneurysm. Surgery was attempted. The damage catastrophic. I stood at his bedside for 5 days. I counted them like penitents, each one an offering of whispered promises. I held his hand, skin warm but unresponsive, and read aloud from the book we had started together before he left. I told him about the garden, about the way the tomatoes were threatening to overrun their cages, about the neighbors asking when he would be back. I prayed in languages I didn't even believe in, because faith is a shape-shifter when desperation arrives. But miracles do not run on our timetables. James never opened his eyes again. At 37 years old, he was gone, his story sealed not with a grand conclusion, but with a silence that filled the room until it pushed me against the walls. The nightmare of losing him was only sharpened by where it happened.